Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Daily Defender. Great to be back with everybody. Glad you're with us. Glad to be getting another video out. We're going to have some fun with this one. This is pretty interesting. Before we get into that, I've got to first just say thank you to all of the kind words that I received and comments, so forth, on the current health condition. I really didn't bring that up in the last video to kind of get down that path or go down that path. I really was just trying to explain why we had had such a long gap in between videos, but the comments were so nice. I thought I'd just give a little bit of more information. Yes, a year ago, almost to the day, I was diagnosed with large B-cell lymphoma. Went through surgery, complete removal of a tumor on a small intestine, a little bit of recovery, and then straight into a 5-month chemo treatment, which appears to be had been completely successful. Just last week, I had my 6-month PET scan, and it's another scan that looks very, very good. They have no concerns whatsoever. Blood work, standard blood work, was all in the green. Hadn't seen that in a year and a half, and we're just waiting on the 6-month MRD test now to come back negative. The last 2 have come back negative, so obviously we're hopeful there. I feel great. I don't have any symptoms. Talk with some other doctors, and they don't have any concerns. So anyways, that is the update. Just thank you for, again, all of the kind words, and appreciate that. And for everybody who's going through that, I'm now part of that community, and I wish you the best. And from a PR standpoint, or just a statement without preaching to anybody, watch the patterns in your life, talk with your doctors, and make sure that you are an advocate for yourself. I probably wouldn't be sitting here if I hadn't been. So stick with it, keep asking questions, asking to see specialists, ask for the scan, ask for the blood work, whatever. If something doesn't feel right, it might not be right, and it might be serious. So, okay, that's the end of the PR message. Back into what we want to talk about today. I had to get back into a Smith & Wesson. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed the SP 2022 SIG video, obviously, and had a lot of great comments on that, so thanks again. But and of course, the usual admin, please subscribe and love the comments. I'm sure I'll get some on this one. This thing is pretty interesting. This is actually a Smith & Wesson 5903, and we'll get into it in the deep dive, but this one's a little bit interesting. Some of you guys and girls with keen eyes might already be picking up on some things, but we're going to talk about a Smith & Wesson 5309. We'll talk a little bit about, the first and second and third generation, just to do a refresher on that. We'll get into what this is, how long they made them, and all that kind of good stuff. So glad to be back with everybody. Thanks again, and let's get into this Smith & Wesson 5903 in our deep dive. I just introduced in the video, incorrectly there at one point, this is a Smith & Wesson 5903. 5903. So let's get that straight. Hopefully we won't have any more errors on that. But yeah, this is interesting. You already may be kind of picking up some eagle eyes there. This is a Mark Atlanta Police Department. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And yeah, this is a clear and safe firearm, so we can do that straight away. So we can kind of work with this now here on. But this is the Smith & Wesson 5903, and as some of you probably know or have been on this channel already, this is one of Smith & Wesson's all-metal hammer-fired guns. Smith & Wesson made these from really, if you want to call it, the mid-1950s all the way through the early to mid-2000s, maybe the late 2000s, depending on contract. But they made these all-metal hammer-fired guns from that period. We've talked about it before on the channel, but just to kind of do a refresher, the first-gen guns like the Model 39 or 59, those were the first ones that came through. Like I said, the very first one was the Smith & Wesson 39 in the 50s, and then you got into the 70s. The first generation carried all the way through the 70s. And then into the 80s, you got to the second generation gun. By the very late 80s, and I'm talking 88 and 89, the third gen guns already started to come into play, but they're generally considered a 90s, kind of platform. And then again, kind of went the way of the Glock, as we all know, as the late 90s and 2000s took over. And this is a third generation gun, so this is going to fall into that 1990s type of category, but we'll get into a few more specifics on that. But these were obviously extremely popular with law enforcement, as were all of them, right? As we've talked about in the channel, the Illinois State Police were the first major law enforcement agency to use the Model 39 in 1967, 68, depending on when you started. Then you obviously had more adoption of semi-automatic pistols in the 80s. You had the FBI starting to use them, other agencies, and then in the 90s, late 80s, 90s, it became Smith & Wesson still owned a large portion of the law enforcement market. I think 70 or 80%, depending on how you look at it. And there were a lot of third-gen guns. That was the kind of the last hurrah for these all-metal hammer-fired guns before Glock really kind of took over. So, got a third-generation 5903 here. Just to kind of wrap that up from that particular standpoint, the 5903 specifically was made from officially 1990 to 1998. But what's interesting about this firearm, this has a serial number that falls into the 1989-1990 range. So this is a very, very early 5903. There's some talk that even late 88, the Smith & Wesson started to introduce these, or at least made them available. And obviously that would kind of be true because this falls into the 1989-90 range. The Atlanta Police Department, which is the gun we're referring to here, started the adoption of these in 1991, at least all the research I could find. And it was an issued pistol. And we'll get into this too. This is what I kind of call a department spec gun as we do the walk around. And they used it for, about 6 years. They ran it to about 1997 when it was replaced by the Glock. So that's kind of its lineage, right? Your 90s to 98s. Atlanta PD used it, if you kind of want to cut it that way, almost the exact same time frame, 91 to 97 or what have you. So pretty interesting in that regard. The specs, before we forget that, because I know everybody likes the specs, it's a 28-ounce firearm. It's a 4-inch stainless steel barrel. It's 7.5 inches in length, about 5.4 inches in height, and about 1.2 in width, depending on where you draw the lines. It is a stainless steel slide with an aluminum frame with this kind of satin finish, and I'll come back to that. All the third-gen guns at this point now had a wraparound xenon grip, so you can kind of see that there. And that's kind of our setup here. So let's go straight into the deep dive. And I think this is going to be kind of a shorter video because we've talked about third-gen guns before. But again, just kind of do our deep dive. Again, you've got the stainless steel slide with this kind of matte finish on the top, which Smith was known for. Just, very nice machining, but very clean, pretty simple. You've got Smith & Wesson, Springfield, Mass, stamped here. You've got rear serrations. You've got your decocker safety here. We'll come back to that. If we flip it over on this side of the slide, or on this side of the gun on the slide, there's nothing here. Pretty beefy extractor overall. This is the longer extractor that almost all of the Smith & Wessons eventually went to. It does have an ambi decocker safety here. If we kind of go back on this side, this is the aluminum frame that I referred to, right? And it had this satin finish, and I don't know if it's really being picked up there. There you can kind of see it. It's kind of this slate gray, pale gray finish. At times I've seen it a little bit lighter on guns. Here the light is picking it up more than it is really in reality or to the naked eye. It's darker here in person. I think the lights are bleaching this out a little bit. This satin finish, at least from my experience, didn't really wear that well. I've seen a lot of firearms that are kind of beat up and nicked up and all that kind of thing. I think in this case, this firearm is in extremely good shape. I would say, good to very good, but almost given its age and the fact that I know how this satin wore, and you can kind of see some of the, there's a high point there. You can see kind of how it wore. And coming back on the beaver tail, you can see how it wore. But considering this was a duty firearm that was issued, it's in excellent condition. I would have to say this was either very lightly used or may have been a backup gun, so to speak, in the armory or something to that effect. Because if this was that early, if this was issued, or serial number was 88 to 1990, and Atlanta went to them in 1991, this gun would have been in holsters for a while, but it just doesn't appear to have that kind of wear. So kind of lucked out there. But just walking around as we usually do, I got this large slide stop, slide release. You've got the squared trigger guard. Again, a very nice cutout here that Smith was known for. Front serrations here. We kind of, mag release, obviously. We kind of already talked about the one-piece wraparound xenon grip. This one has a bit more of the curved back strap. There was more straighter back strap, but this appears to be original. We come down on this side of the slide, or the frame. We've got a small Smith & Wesson stamp trademark, and of course a very nicely done and still very legible Atlanta Police Department. Coming on top of the gun and back to the slide, these were the traditional metal 3-dot Novak sights, but you can already see these were night sights. So this is probably the first spec on this gun, what I'd call a department spec, minus the actual stamping of Atlanta PD. The metal night sights for early 90s, I think that was, you know, pretty unique. I'm not sure all the departments were using that. And then let's just jump to it. The third part is the bobbed hammer, right? Like I said earlier in the video, I think some of your folks with keen eyes may have picked up that this was a bobbed hammer version. And so that was pretty neat. In fact, I just saw literally the other day, you know, Smith & Wesson has posted some of this 3rd gen 5906 stuff, and they seem like they're, you know, trolling a little bit or trying to get some interest, or I don't know what they're doing with that, implying that they're going to bring back a 3rd gen gun, which would be amazing. But one of the comments in there was that they should bring it back with no rail and a bobbed hammer and an aluminum frame. And I'm like, wait a minute, you just described the Atlanta Police Department 5903 guns. I just found that crazy ironic. But that's, you know, that's, and it has, you know, traditional beaver tail here for Smith & Wesson. And just you know, very well done. This was really a nice shape. As I stated, I was really fortunate to find this. No box. It just came with one mag. It came with the traditional Smith & Wesson, you know, 15-round mag. Well done. These were all metal mags with the orange follower, which was fairly popular, and then just kind of a polymer base plate. Not really a beveled magwell, but just a very large magwell, and its magazines are in and out very easy, so no issue there. But again, just a really neat find. I don't always find, you know, marked law enforcement trade-in guns, or, you know, retired guns, if that's what you want to call it, and certainly in decent shape. This one was really unique to find. It was very enjoyable. I didn't really have a great 5903. I had one that was pretty beat up, and I decided to move on from it. So this was great to see. But again, in double action, single action, we've talked about that on this channel. And this gun did have the, and again, we've checked it, but we'll check it again. The magazine disconnect, and we've talked about that. This was a Smith & Wesson design, or, you know, just traditional way of them setting up their firearm. Not unlike some other firearms, right? You had a Browning high power that had a magazine disconnect, if I remember correctly, and some others. And there's a bit of a love-hate relationship with this disconnect. It doesn't bother me at all, and there's some interesting history to it. But obviously the gun in its configuration, you would, you know, rack around, and you would be in a single action mode. And there you get a very good look at that bobbed hammer. You would then drop the hammer down, which is extremely safe to do. The gun is designed to do this, and it's now in a safe condition mode. You would then flip the safety up. Red is dead, so you can see the red dot. And this was the traditional way to carry it. I had a 5904 as an off-duty gun back in the day, and this is exactly how I carried it. So this is that setup. And again, the gun would, at this point, you've got your round chambered. The pull on this gun is interesting. It's very smooth. It's a nice pull. It really is. It's smooth. It's not overly long. The gun would then fire, and you'd be in a single action mode. And then, of course, your reset is there, and then the trigger breaks. We've talked about it before, the single action mode and that trigger reset on the Smith & Wesson semi-autos for the day was fantastic, and I just don't think it gets enough recognition, but we've talked about that before. So this is our 5903 Atlanta Police Department gun. I do know that the Gwinnett Police Department, which I think is a suburb of Atlanta, if I remember it right, if that's the right term. I know not every city uses, or surrounding communities use the suburb word, but Gwinnett utilized these. I don't know, I wasn't able to confirm if the Georgia State Patrol, State Police used this as well at one point. But again, it's not uncommon at all, in my opinion, with that suburb of Gwinnett and maybe others, right? They may not have had anything stamped on it, but they may have jumped on a contract or may have known that Atlanta PD was using it, so the chief of another department decided they would use it. Pretty sure that's how the department back in the day that I worked for, how we wound up with our Smith & Wesson revolvers. So because the big city was using those still at the time. But anyways, I wanted to bring this to you guys. Again, just kind of a neat find, another little piece of history, definitely a piece of law enforcement history. We talk about it a lot on this channel, how involved and entrenched Smith & Wesson was with law enforcement for decades, right? Obviously, all of the revolvers when that was the thing, and then they did an excellent job of getting into the semi-automatic platforms and those contracts for, again, decades, until we had the Glock phenomenon kind of come through and change the whole game. But not a super long video today. We've talked about third generation guns before, but find one that's stamped Atlanta PD, I thought that was pretty cool. So thanks again for coming to the channel, and we'll see everybody again very, very soon on the Daily Defender.